Quentin, for that introduction, and thank you to the Levantine Heritage Foundation, and particularly to Philip Mansell for helping organise this talk this evening. And thank you indeed to all of you for coming and listening. This is really the distilled essence of my master's thesis, and it's a great pleasure to be able to talk about it to other people. The Russian émigrés of the early 20th century, for those of us that have read about them, are more usually associated with the centres of Western Europe, Berlin, Paris or London, or yet further afield, New York, Sao Paulo or Harbin. Yet the greatest single exodus of Russian émigrés came through Constantinople, and for a time that city had the highest density of Russian émigrés in the world. Russian culture had a profound effect on the twilight of the Ottoman Empire, and even now its legacy can be felt in parts of Istanbul. Just a note on the nomenclature, by the way, I'll be using the term Constantinople to describe the capital of the Ottoman Empire, which holds true until 1923, at which point it became Istanbul, and Ankara, of course, the capital of modern Turkey. This is a story that really begins in St. Petersburg, and specifically in a series of riots that erupted in late February 1917, according to the Julian calendar still in use at the time, giving the riots their nickname, the February Days, as Russians in the imperial capital took to the streets to protest high bread prices and other pressures of wartime, and the increasingly alienated autocracy of Nicholas II. After widespread violence and increased chaos, exacerbated by the desertion of thousands of troops made the capital ungovernable, Nicholas II abdicated in March 1917, signing the papers in a train carriage. The consequences of this momentous act were to play out over the following years in bloody fashion, as vying factions competed to establish a new political order. Control over the city of St. Petersburg was secured by the Bolsheviks in the October Revolution of 1917, more properly speaking, a coup d'etat, orchestrated by Trotsky overnight, signalled by a shot from the cruiser Aurora at anchor in the River Neva, while Lenin overlooked things from the Smolny Institute in the northeast, a former finishing school for girls. A fierce struggle then erupted, however, for control of the Russian Empire, an area roughly 1/6 of the world's landmass, that saw unrest and population displacement on an unprecedented scale. This map gives an indication of the vast swathes of territory in Western Russia alone that saw fighting, and illustrates the three key fronts: the northwestern, here, the eastern, here, and the southern front, as well as depicting in the north, around Arkhangelsk, the Allied intervention, an expedition of Marines with a squadron of Sopwith camels that tried to keep Russia in the war. Meanwhile, Trotsky's armoured war train shuttled around the interior, managing Bolshevik resistance. For various reasons of these fragmented conflicts, it was the southern front that was to play the leading role in the anti-Bolshevik military campaigns. Initially, their commander was the Cossack Kornilov, a charismatic general who had masterminded the counter-offensives against the Germans and Austrians under Kerensky's provisional government in June 1917. His volunteer army helped secure the Black Sea ports of Odessa and Crimea in the south of Russia, and those ports lured a significant number of refugees south from the conflict in hope of securing a passage to Western Europe. In opposition to the Bolshevik Reds, those who backed Kornilov and the other commanders were dubbed the Whites, a catch-all term that embraced soldiers and civilians alike. In reality, the label denoted a patchwork opposition, bringing together groups as diverse as ancien regime aristocrats, modern industrialists, anti-Bolshevik peasants, Orthodox monks, and their foreign backers. This poster is a product of the Bolshevik propaganda machine, and it tries to emphasize how brought together, or how similar the white resistance was. They're all under a flag here that says, "Fight the workers and peasants." But in fact, they can't help but convey how disparate the white forces really are. We have a man that looks like a businessman here, a general, a priest, what looks here like a kulak or a rich farm owner. And so this was an extraordinarily disparate group of people that we're talking with. In early 1918, Kornilov was killed when a shell landed on his farmhouse, and command of the Whites passed to this man, Anton Denikin, for 2 years. Denikin wasn't as successful a commander as Kornilov, and his austere style alienated many of his officers, further weakening the White cause. As the Reds advanced, the Whites were forced to retreat to the Crimean Peninsula, and from Ukrainian territory in the west, they were harried by Nestor Makhno's anarchist Black Army. In April 1920, Denikin handed over command to Pyotr Wrangel, but Wrangel was only able to fight a rearguard action. After the Soviets signed a ceasefire with the Poles in 1920, putting an end to the Soviet-Polish War, they were able to concentrate their forces on the south. In early November 1920, crossing ice that had frozen over the water separating the North Crimea from the mainland, the Whites stormed the peninsula and pushed on towards Sevastopol. This is a picture of white émigrés leaving Crimea towards Istanbul. Wrangel had taken extensive precautions to ensure that there were sufficient ships to transport those that wanted to leave. There followed the largest seaborne evacuation before Dunkirk, as 150,000 white Russians left on board a motley collection of warships, private boats and yachts for Constantinople, the Bolsheviks snapping at their heels. Just a few words about Constantinople, the city they arrived in. This is a shot from the air, just to point out a few landmarks. This is Hagia Sophia, the Blue Mosque, the Hippodrome, and Topkapi Palace is there. That's the Golden Horn, and the Bosphorus stretching towards the Black Sea extends above the photograph. The city they arrived in was still the capital of the Ottoman Empire, but it was dramatically reduced. A puppet sultan sat on the throne, whose ministers had concluded a punitive peace treaty with the Entente powers by the Mudros Armistice, signed on board a British battleship in October 1918. Then, using the armistice as a dubious legal basis on which to operate, British and French troops had occupied the city before the year was out. So it's still 1918. And these ships here are British and French warships. The French commander, General Louis Franchet d'Espèrey, entered the city on a white horse, in a move heavy with symbolism, as Mehmed the Conqueror had done the same when the Ottomans captured Constantinople in 1453. This isn't actually a photograph of Louis Franchet d'Espèrey, but I thought it was interesting because of the flags that we have here, which are French and Greek, and couldn't help but convey the symbolism of Europeans essentially wresting control of the city away from the Ottoman government. In turn, the British High Commissioner, a man with a wonderful name, Somerset Arthur Gough Calthorpe, arrested over 150 resistant ministers and promptly interned 30 of them in Malta. British submarines were in the Golden Horn, and here we have battleships stuffing the Bosphorus. Shortly before the Russian troops arrived, the August 1920 Treaty of Sèvres had retroactively legitimated the occupation of 1918 and imposed radically reduced boundaries on a rump Turkish state. Nationalist forces under Ataturk would fight to undo this settlement and would eventually succeed in 1923 with the ratification of the Treaty of Lausanne. But it's worth pausing here, I think, to consider how the Turkey of the day, as ratified by the peace treaties that were satellite treaties to Versailles, how the Treaty of Sèvres made Turkey look in the minds of those that participated. And I think what's interesting here is the sort of schizophrenia we have between Wilsonian nationalism and European colonialist ideologies. To be more clear, this went to Greece, the blue areas. So Izmir, formerly Smyrna, and Edirne, Adrianople, were considered to be Greek. This vast swathe, and I think this map here slightly exaggerates it, but this was all to Italy, on the basis of its occupation of the Dodecanese and a few other islands. And this space here in red was going to be an international area, but administered by the British. So really, Constantinople at this time had actually been internationalized and been taken out of the hands of any one people, with the British very much playing a caretaker role. And then on the other hand, on the Wilsonian hand, we have here a Kurdish state and a greater Armenia stretching all the way to the Black Sea. This treaty of Sèvres has assumed enormous importance for both Armenians and Kurds, and particularly given the recent election results in Turkey, I thought this is a topical moment to pause in terms of the Kurdish issue. So here we have it, the entry of troops over Galata Bridge here, that's the new mosque. With Sèvres in 1920, the occupation began in earnest. British and French forces took the districts most critical to municipal administration, Galata and Pera, modern Beyoğlu, and the modern Sultanahmet district, respectively. But there were also Italians in Üsküdar, Greeks in the Fanar, and a host of other foreigners. Japan's alliance with the Entente meant that it too had soldiers among the occupying powers, although unfortunately I haven't been able to find any Japanese memoirists of that time. There were Indian sepoys in the British army in Istanbul, Constantinople, and there were Senegalese among the French troops, as well as, in the words of one historian, a large colony of Americans made up of relief workers and businessmen eager to cash in on an anticipated boom. Streets of Beyoğlu, roughly speaking the European quarter of Constantinople, were where these contrasts were most evident. And I think this is a wonderful illustration of that. We have here, of course, troops and civilians, but could break it down even more. We have men wearing the Ottoman fez, which was a symbol of Tanzimat-era reforms of the 19th century, next to others wearing trilbies and I think a few bowler hats in the background. And this is a particularly good contrast. These two boys here, one looks like an Ottoman sherbet or water seller, and this boy here with a sort of slick side parting looks like he could be waiting at the Pera Palace. So this was a city alive with contradictions and a real riot of different peoples. And this is perhaps best illustrated by the American bakery. You can see here this cheerful baker underneath signs in Ottoman Turkish, English, Greek, Russian, and I think that's Hebrew and Armenian at the end, but people will have to correct me there. Into this maelstrom, the Russian evacuees from the Crimea arrived under the leadership of Baron Wrangel. Again, their arrival in the city had a significance that illustrated the upheavals of World War I had wrought across Europe and the Middle East. Russian claims to Constantinople, or Tsargrad, had mounted over the course of the 19th century, so that soon after war broke out, Nicholas II had issued a manifesto in St. Petersburg, demanding the fulfillment of Russia's historic mission on the shores of the Bosphorus. The British and the French later agreed to recognize these claims in a series of secret meetings concluded in London in spring 1915, in return for which the Russians gave the British and the French a freer hand in the Middle East. At about the same time, spring 1915, the British Gallipoli campaign aimed to take control of the Dardanelles, and thereby force a route through to the Black Sea that could have seen vital supplies reach southern Russia if it had succeeded, kept Russia in the war and the Tsar in the Winter Palace. It was an irony not lost on many contemporary observers then, that as at last the Russians had an army in Istanbul, it came not as an army of conquerors but of refugees. The Turkish aristocrat Müftüzade Ziya Bey was to observe, really, the dream of making Constantinople a Russian city has partly come true, but it has turned into a nightmare. There are various responses to the challenges posed by living in a city on the verge of collapse. With a tall and imposing Wrangel here addressing troops on one of the ships moored off Constantinople. Exile would not be the last word. The battle for Russia has not ceased, he declared. It has merely taken on new forms. He worked tirelessly for the good of the Russian army and saw its well-being as the first step and foundation stone towards realizing a vision of Russian государственность, or statehood, abroad. A concept came to life here as in other European centers, Russkaya zarubezhye, Russia abroad. A full structure of command was quickly established within the reconstituted army, and 3 distinct camps, separated from Constantinople itself, were established at Çatalca in Thrace, on the island of Lemnos, and at Gallipoli, the very place that could have decided the war in the Russians' favour 5 years before. What began to take shape was a Russia in miniature, in the words of one historian, that emphasized the cultural values of the old order, and even the language. Same historian goes on to say that the soldiers encamped at Gallipoli used a code of chivalry and that of a distinguished warrior class to unite themselves and distinguish themselves from the Bolsheviks. I think this photo is a wonderful illustration too of quite to what length the Russians went in order to keep this sort of cultural ideas alive. We have here men in full regimental dress, and even, I don't know if you've noticed, but a backdrop with the towers of the Kremlin, and all against a sort of wooden house there, which is rather incongruous. This photo here is actually a photo of the officers' quarters. So imagine where the men must have been living, the same encampment. In spite of these hardships, Wrangel insisted on maintaining decorum among the Russian troops. And it's interesting to note that unlike a lot of very well-connected Russian aristocrats and generals, he also did not go straight to Paris, which is what most of them did. He instead turned down the Brits' offer to get on a battleship to Malta or Piraeus and then go over by train, but instead insisted on staying and organising his men in person. Here they are on parade. Here they are dedicating a monument to their fallen comrades, probably shouldn't use that word actually, fallen fellows at Gallipoli. And this monument is still there, although it was rebuilt a few years ago. This is an extraordinary photo. This is a tent church on the island of Lemnos, where in the midst of the Émigré encampment, they set up centres of worship. The priest was a former soldier, and they drew choirs from among the ranks. And here we see a procession carrying an icon to the city. Alexei Wrangel, Baron Wrangel's son, wrote in his memoirs, wearing what one feels sure must be an expression of exuberant national pride, that the Russian church had reconstituted itself so successfully that it even managed to engineer its own schism. This is along pre-revolution lines of old believers and so on. In other ways too, a substantial cultural life began to take shape. With help from a number of Russian aid organisations stretched across Europe, reading rooms in 9 separate locations were set up for scholarly pursuits, and 68,000 volumes purchased to stock them. Alexei Wrangel later wrote of the encampment at Gallipoli that it became one big school, and in this respect the American aid organisations were crucial, specifically the Red Cross, who took some of these photos. A theatre was also established at Gallipoli with an impressive run of performances, though one feels sure they probably erred on the side of Greek tragedy, given their state. So in a very real sense then, Wrangel's striving after statehood, государственность, can be said to have been successful among his troops. Setting up the army as the pillar of the community, he was to maintain a remarkable degree of cohesion among a large group of people living in catastrophe. What can't be overlooked, however, in understanding this community is that the encampments were essentially dependent on humanitarian aid. When the French announced that they were going to cease food supplies in spring of 1921, it caused a minor crisis until Wrangel was able to reroute aid from a mixture of Russian organisations and the newly constituted League of Nations, who appointed Fridtjof Nansen, the Arctic explorer, to be a special envoy to the Russian communities. It might be mentioned that although vast quantities of wealth were of course lost and ransacked at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, a considerable amount of money was also spent by Russians across Europe in the aftermath, trying to keep fellow Russians from destitution across the continent. By late 1921, Russian volunteer groups and foundations were overseeing soup kitchens feeding 165,000 people a day, a fifth of the population of pre-war Istanbul. This photograph is of a picture of one such soup kitchen at Gallipoli. Yet the 3 encampments at Gallipoli, Chitalia and Lemnos were not the only places Russian emigres resided. For many, the bright lights of Beyoğlu held promise of riches or entertainment, or simply the prospect of plying a trade by which they could earn their keep. Here we encounter the stereotypes that have shaped much popular imagination. A grande dame giving French lessons, Russian counts working as carpenters or secondary school teachers, including one former Russian ambassador to Istanbul, a former professor of mathematics working as a cashier in a restaurant, or as one historian spluttered, writing in the 1930s, a commander-in-chief upon a war front who had made history, was growing cabbages, and not even his own cabbages. At Tuzla, a small camp run by the British, workshops sought to re-educate the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie with practical trades. thus, in a bizarre sense, perhaps accomplishing some of the dreams of the Bolsheviks, listing basket making, toy making, gardening, carpentry, shoemaking, embroidery, dressmaking, and the cleaning of railway coaches under the various occupations they taught. Others were forced to be more inventive. The mystical philosopher Gurdjieff hawked caviar and fish from Galata Bridge for his keep. Lev Nussimbaum, the author of Ali and Nina, and Bulgakov describe in their writings the cockroach races organized by a Russian army officer, Pyotr Borodaevsky, on which soldiers in the city would go to bet in a converted space known as the Kafarodrome. It's easy to be flippant and to romanticize these various occupations as so much color, but desperate poverty was the stark backdrop to the lives of many of those who sought to make their own way in the city. This is a picture of a makeshift stove set up near Dolmabahce Palace, where a group of refugees were sleeping in the open. Many women were forced to engage in prostitution, and racketeering was rife as prized possessions were pawned for next to nothing to buy food. And there are even accounts of Russians on board the ships held in quarantine when they first arrived in Constantinople, letting down wedding rings and family jewellery in exchange for food handed by speculators in boats that rowed out to meet them. That said, Russians were able to infiltrate spheres of Ottoman European high culture and influence tastes to an extraordinary degree, catering both to the appetites of the European forces occupying the city and the curious among the Ottoman elites. Russian patisseries evoking Nevsky Prospect, the Grand Avenue of St. Petersburg, served hot chocolate and pastries, including kulichi and paska Easter cakes. Russian restaurants were tremendously successful. The fact that they employed women to serve tables was a radical innovation in Ottoman society. This created a theatre and spectacle all of its own, as Russian men and women of all classes began to reinvent themselves as aristocrats falling on hard times, a definite riposte to Bolshevik ideas of what should become of the whites. As one Turkish memoirist recalled, the waitresses in Russian restaurants at one restaurant were all supposed to belong to the Russian nobility. So in Pera, it has become the custom to kiss the hand that serves you food. The novelist Tanpınar, one of modern Turkey's great novelists, wryly remarked at the time that it seemed as if everybody had rescued for themselves a title of nobility from the sunken ship called Tsarist Russia. Russian drinking establishments also took off, mostly in the form of singing cafes, or café chantant, and beer gardens, like this one here. The third son of Smirnov, the eponymous vodka maker, also set up a distillery in Constantinople, but had to close as the vodka didn't take with the Turks, and the local Greeks preferred their own duzinka. Elsewhere, the combined talent of Russian performers really made its mark. Serge Yarov put together a Cossack choir which was so successful he spent 3 decades touring with it around the world. Classical musicians played in all the theatres and cinemas of the day with silent film when you could still have live music. And a woman named Lydia Arzumanova, here with her ballet troupe, founded a school which taught in Istanbul for many years and is here in the midst of a performance in the 1930s. These various strands came together in dramatic fashion in the form of the various cabaret nightclubs, where it became de rigueur to be seen of an evening. Stella's was a club owned by a black American from Mississippi, the son of former slaves, who had improbably lived in Moscow for a time before the war, and whose real name was Frederick Thomas, rechristened Fyodorovich. And it's thanks to this man that the Charleston and the Foxtrot were introduced to Constantinople in these cafés chantants and nightclubs. He later died in a debtor's prison, gambling all and unfortunately losing big. This, however, is a contemporary advert for Maxime Stella, his place. Rather fun, I think, because it has dancing next to 5 o'clock teas. And this wonderful line: the management have the supreme honour to have been granted permission from British GHQ for British officers and their families to dance in its establishment every day. One feels sure they did. This man is Alexander Vertinsky, who opened something called the Black Rose Cabaret with a companion. And Russian émigrés famously drank themselves into oblivion there. Levantine made his name as a singer of songs of haunting melancholy in the 1920s and 1930s before being overcome by a sense of sadness and going back to Soviet Russia. And his career and the way in which he played on the emotions of many Russians is, I think, an apt symbol for many of the other émigrés. In these nightclubs, money was squandered, and a sort of apocalyptic revel was acted out by many Russians clutching at the high society that had been destroyed by war and revolution, or grieving its loss, and in the last months of another dying empire. It was literally a form of decadence, and a time when cocaine and champagne flowed. Inevitably, it also contained the seeds of its own undoing. Among more sober-minded Turks, the Russians were depicted as agents of vice and debauchery. I have Philip to thank for this quote, but hand in glove with the Russian and British and French colonialists, and a petition of 32 prominent women in the city stated, "Just in the small district of Beyoğlu that lies between Tunel and Taksim, the number of Russian bars, cafés chantants and restaurants which ply their reprehensible trade, free of all regulation and hygienic control, exceeds 25. In these places, each of which is a place of execution for innocence, hundreds of young Turks drag their health, wealth and honour into the whirlpool of calamity every night." I feel Frederick Thomas should have had that on his advert. For Ataturk building the new nation of Turkey in Ankara in the Anatolian heartland, this was very much something that needed to be opposed. And he characterized Beyoğlu and Russian Constantinople as a sort of modern Sodom and Gomorrah, and really founded Turkey on the basis that he would push out this European vice and clean the city and rechristen Constantinople Istanbul. And that, incidentally, is why many of them left in 1923. I have maybe a few minutes more, so perhaps I'll just say something briefly about Russian women. Although most of the Russian émigrés were men, being soldiers, Russian women, if anything, had a more profound impact on Ottoman culture and the culture of the nascent Turkish nation. As I mentioned before, many worked as waitresses, French teachers, governesses, and if they could, as musicians or dancers. Others were forced into prostitution. This is a lady on one of the boats coming over with her son. Many found their self-confidence and style, many in Ottoman society found their self-confidence and style captivating in a society still used to seeing many women adhering to traditional and discreet Islamic dress codes. Russian women broke down gender boundaries in public space, at the theatre, for example, or on public transport. And these are Turkish men quite clearly being completely distracted from whatever's happening on stage in front of them at the sight of these Russian beauties. In other ways, they left their mark on tastes. Many Russian women sported bob haircuts we associate with the 1920s, but not all for aesthetic reasons. As on passing through quarantine, many had to have their hair cut short for disinfection from lice. This lady has one such haircut. And this in turn created fashion, as this Ottoman advert shows. And people started to emulate what became known as Rusbaşa, or Russian head. And the verb ruslashmak, to become Russian, or to Russianize oneself, gained currency. It's a sort of Zelda Fitzgerald-esque type look, and they're even sort of labelled here. Unfortunately, my Ottoman isn't good enough for that. One for you, Yasmin, after the summer. This is a cartoon of a Russian girl who appears to have been crying, with a caption below that reads, "Why do people accuse me of dressing indecently? Can't they see that I have my hair tightly done up?" And it sort of illustrates the cultural clashes that these ladies really represented in public space, where exposing a lot more sort of décolleté cuts and having freely flowing hair. Entrepreneurial Russians rented a stretch of the beach and decided to start open-air bathing there. And Russians, along with the jazz age and the foxtrot, also brought semi-nude bathing to Istanbul. And here we see two Russian women, and this here is a young Turkish man dreaming of them. And there are sort of obvious moral overtones as to what these women mean for Turkish society. And as if this isn't pointed enough, This humorous cartoon says, the caption read, how do accidents happen? Russian women cross the road. Two drivers. And then one last one on this theme. This is a depiction of the Russians leaving the city. So these are helpless Turkish men, Ottoman men, throwing themselves into the hands of all the Russian ladies about to get on this boat and leave. That's all so much stereotype. So I wanted to end with this photo, which I think really conveys, again, in a more domestic sense, or natural sense, perhaps some of the difference of the Russian communities here. We see sort of flapper culture or 1920s culture, and children along with businessmen, perhaps writers, and more traditional Orthodox communities. Hinting at the extraordinary variety of Russian society in Constantinople and its energy. Countess Vera Tolstoy, cousin of the author, said, "If the martyrs of the French Revolution showed their butchers how nobles die, we, the victims of Bolshevik crime, who have yet escaped with our lives, shall show them how to live." And as J.D. Quirk, a journalist writing for The Observer at the time, argued in an article entitled "The Constantinople Paradox," Russian émigrés, in the heart of their destitution, showed themselves to have that eternally enviable quality of throwing off the past, throwing off the fear of the future, and making gay the present. So I think in their honour we should end this talk on that note. Thank you very much.